everyone. We are coming to you live from Purdue University with our Plant Science, the Green Machine Zip Trip. I'm Jessica, your Purdue Zip Trip guide. Now we have students all over the country watching this broadcast. Just take a look at this. We've got students from Peru High School. Hey guys. Wow, you seem really excited. What are you, The Walking Dead over there? Can I get a little bit more enthusiasm? Hi, Peru High School. Oh, good. I got some laughs, too. Well, that's how we like to start things out here. We're going to learn a lot of fun things today. Now, while we cannot see all of you out there, today's Zip Trip is interactive, and you have a chance for your voice to be heard. If you have any question for any of the scientists throughout today's show, just email them to us at ziptrips@purdue.edu. And today we are using a technology called Purdue Hot Seat to take student questions. So everyone say hello to Abby. She's our Hot Seat correspondent. Hi, Abby.
Hi, everyone. Hot Seat is a social media program that lets students use computers, cell phones, and other mobile devices to post questions and vote on the ones that they would like to see asked on the show. Today we have 12 schools in the Hot Seat. They are Union County High School in Liberty, Indiana, Avon High School in Avon, Indiana, Whiteland Community High School in Whiteland, Indiana, Housatonic Valley Regional High School in Falls Village, Connecticut, Manheim Central High School in Manheim, Pennsylvania, Oakleaf High School in Orange Park, Florida, Brownsburg High School in Brownsburg, Indiana, Plainfield High School in Plainfield, Indiana, John Overton High School in Nashville, Tennessee, Walker Valley High School in Cleveland, Tennessee, and Zionsville Community High School in Zionsville, Indiana, and the Upward Bound in Iowa City, Iowa. You can get started by going to the topic number 1 to post and vote on questions for our first scientist.
Wow, that's a long list, and that's only a smidge of the students joining us today. We've got almost 2,000 students, so thanks for that, Abby. Now, we look forward to hearing from those schools throughout today's program. This Zip Trip is all about plant science. Do you know how broad the subject of plant science is? Well, today we're going to find out. First, we are going to meet a scientist who is working on invasive species, in other words, invaders that can harm or even destroy native plants. Then we'll connect with a Purdue scientist to learn about genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, and how they may make a difference in our food supply. And finally, we will work with Purdue plant scientist who is studying the carbon cycle of plants and how it may be affecting climate change. And we're going to run one of his experiments right here in the studio. So, get ready to meet some scientists, have some fun, and learn something too. This Zip Trip is all about plant science, the Green Machine.
Every one of you watching this screen, look out.
This town is in danger.
It's indestructible. It's indescribable. Nothing can stop it. How can it be stopped? Mob hysteria sweeps one city. Before long, the nation, and then the world could fall.
Run for your lives! No, actually, stay there for the time being until we're done with today's show. So today, we are learning that plant science covers a wide array of subjects. Virtually every aspect of life on this planet relates to plants and plant science. And as we just saw, even plants have to worry about being invaded. One of the plant scientists here working on invasive species at Purdue is with us today, Mike Jenkins. Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Welcome to the show. This is your first time on the show.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
And Mike, I mentioned before the break that your research involves working on invasive species. That sounds so ominous, so mysterious. So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, invasive species are non-native species, but not all non-native species are invasive. For a species to be invasive, it has to to invade an area, and also be able to establish and reproduce in numbers that start to cause either ecological damage, economic damage, or start to have negative effects on human health.
Gotcha. And so are these invaders caused by humans? Do people bring these invasive species in on purpose?
They do. Invasives can be brought in on purpose, and there are a lot of our ornamental plants and a lot of our food plants that were originally brought in as food were introduced that way. And they're also brought in accidentally. They can be brought in as packing material. Sometimes they sneak in and ride in on other things that are brought in. We have a lot of pests that are brought in on plants that are imported to be planted, ornamental plants. And when these plants are brought in, they can have pretty serious ecological effects because they don't really have any native competitors. They don't have any enemies. In fact, this is called the enemy release, that when they come into their introduced range, nothing really wants to eat them, and they don't have any diseases and any pests, so they can really put all their energy towards growth.
Gotcha. So can you give us examples of these invasive species?
Yeah, well, the intro had the classic kudzu, which
Sure.
was taking over the world. But here in the Midwest is an example of one of the ones that's a introduced species is right here, and this is a mere honeysuckle.
Wow.
And,
It's pretty.
Yeah, and this is one that was very pretty, and that's why it was brought here. It's brought here as an ornamental, because many of the things that make plants a problem invader make them desirable for us to grow. Because this thing, you can plant it, it'll grow anywhere, it grows fast, and it has these really pretty red berries that once it starts to exclude native plants, the birds will eat this because they have very little left. And then when the birds do what birds do, they tend to spread the berries and the plant further around, and then it invades new areas. So that's an example of a planned introduction. And then many of the problems we have with insects and disease were accidental introductions. One example right now throughout the eastern U.S. is emerald ash borer, which is an unintentional introduction that's killing ash trees.
What?
Emerald ash borer.
Say that 3 times.
Emerald ash borer, emerald ash borer.
I believe you. I know you can do it. But continue on.
Okay. And that was introduced, and it's causing some pretty severe effects throughout the eastern U.S. And it's one of those things where we keep having these accidental introductions, and we just don't seem to learn our lesson.
Interesting. I never thought of honeysuckle as being an invasive species. And I've heard that some forests are being damaged by invasive species. Are certain types of trees being invaded?
Yeah. I guess to start at the very beginning, the first tree that was really affected by an invasive species was American chestnut. And he has some pictures here. Unfortunately, this is after American chestnut was already killed off by a fungal disease called chestnut blight. It was introduced in New York in 1904, New York City, and pretty much spread throughout the range of eastern chestnut and killed pretty much all the chestnut. At one time, chestnut was the dominant tree in the Appalachian Mountains. 1 in 4 trees were chestnut, and extended as far west as southern Ohio and southern Indiana. And it was such an important species, and such a strong desire to bring it back, that there's a really broad effort, and Purdue University is part of this, to take Asian chestnut, which has genes that make it resistant to the blight, since they co-evolved, they're both from Asia, and breed that with American chestnut, and then take that hybrid and do what they call backcrossing, where you breed it again with the pure American chestnut to try to produce a tree that has mostly native American chestnut genes, but retains the genes from the Asian chestnut to give it blight resistance.
Gotcha.
And that's an effort that's ongoing, but as of now, chestnut has pretty much been eliminated from the eastern forest.
That's terrible. So are there other consequences beyond just the economic ones?
Yeah, I mean, economics, especially for something like chestnut, are obvious because of the nuts, roasting chestnuts, and the fact it's a very important timber species. But the ecological effects can be more severe because all these species that we lose or that get excluded by invasive species have roles. They have services they provide in an ecosystem. And a way to think of these services can be like a wheel, where each spoke might represent a species and the services that species provides. It can be nutrient cycling, it can serve as food or shelter, and it could be food. But as you start to lose species, you lose these services. And if you lose a few spokes from a wheel, the wheel will still function. But the concern is as you lose more and more spokes, that eventually that wheel will cease to function and collapse. Yes.
The consequences of invasive species are way more than a person might think they are. Now, you said that insects can be invasive species as well. Why do you study insects?
Well, I study insects because I'm a plant scientist, but within the span of plant science, I'm a plant ecologist. And invasive insects tend to, they attack plants. They tend to eliminate plants from the ecosystem. And I'm very interested in not only what happens to that plant, but what happens when you remove that plant from the system, how removing that plant might affect the will we talked about. And one of the species I study is hemlock woolly adelgid. And this is another species that has been introduced in the Appalachians and is moving north and south in the Appalachians. It's been killing all the hemlock, pretty similar to what chestnut did at the turn of the century.
And that's hemlock right there?
Well, it's dead hemlock.
Dead
This is all from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and that's what hemlock looks like after it meets the hemlock woolly adelgid.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, so it's been a pretty serious problem. And right now it's in the Appalachians. There are pockets of hemlock in the Midwest as well. It might be harder to reach those. But what kills this tree is this tiny, tiny little insect. This is a hemlock woolly adelgid. It's like an aphid. And if you look down below, that little hook-shaped projection is a stylus that it uses to jab into the base of the needle, and it sucks all the sugar out that the leaves are producing. But when it does that, it messes up the tissue that brings that sugar to the rest of the tree and will kill the tree. The tree will starve to death.
Oh, amazing.
And it's called woolly adelgid because it has this coating, this woolly coating that protects the insect.
Sure.
And here you see what it looks like at the base of the needle. So that's a pretty heavily infested hemlock tree.
It almost looks like fake snow.
It does. Looks like something you might see in a Christmas shop.
So are there any other factors that can cause or influence invasive species?
Yeah. Human activities have a great effect upon invasive species. And using the example of hemlock, climate change is thought to potentially have a negative effect on hemlock woolly adelgid or on hemlock. Because right now, hemlock woolly adelgid is limited in how far north it can go within the range of hemlock. And you see a map here that shows that range. Right now, it can't move into New England or into northern Michigan because it can't tolerate very cold temperatures. So that coldest point during the winter, those really cold days, is what keeps it from going further north. But in some work that was done by Jeff Dukes, who we'll be hearing from later, he looked at what would happen if you increased that temperature, if that temperature increased with climate change. And what he found is as temperature increases, that minimum cold temperature gets warmer, and it's potentially may allow the hemlock woolly adelgid to reach trees that it doesn't have access to now.
And then all the hemlock will be killed.
And then you'll lose more and more of the hemlock.
That is a big problem. Now we will be hearing more about plant science and research, as well as how plants can be a factor in other areas like climate change later in our show. So let's go ahead and check back in with Purdue High School. Do you guys have a question for Mike? Do you guys have a question?
Yeah,
Perfect.
Yes. Are there any ash trees that are resistant to the emerald ash borer?
There's studies going on to try to find resistant ash trees. It hasn't been very successful. They haven't found a large number of resistance. They are trying to do like they've done with chestnut and try to breed resistance into ash or try to genetically alter ash to have resistance. But so far, emerald ash borer has been pretty good at killing ash.
And is there a second question for Mike, too, from Purdue High School?
No, not at this time.
Not at this time? Okay. Well, what can we do about invasive species? We've heard a couple of examples that seem really harmful. Let's go ahead and ask our students what they think the best option for dealing with invasive species might be. So, Mike, what are our options, first of all?
Okay. Well, we have several options. The first two can apply to any invasive, but learn lessons for not bringing in future invasions, so stop the invasion before it starts. The second is to refine ways to monitor moving material from one area to another. And this is very important because, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of our accidental introductions happen this way. The third is to regulate chemical treatments to fight insects. And the last one is kind of specific to hemlock woolly adelgid, but could apply to other species, and that's using what's called biocontrol. And in the case of hemlock woolly adelgid, that's introducing predator beetles, or things that actually eat the adelgid, some of its natural enemies, from Asia and the Pacific Northwest to try to control the populations. And the last option is all of the above.
Okay. So for our schools in the hot seat, please go right now to Survey 1 and vote. And then does anyone at Purdue High School have an idea of what the best option would be? What do you guys think? Which option is the best option?
The first one.
The first one? Okay, Abby, we'll get back to you in just a second. Abby, what do the students in the hot seat think the answer is?
The hot seat, too, believe it's the first one. Learn lessons for not bringing in future invasives.
Okay.
That's an excellent answer, because if you can do that, you don't need the other ones. And if we could only learn our lesson and do that, that would be the best answer of all. Unfortunately, if you look at the modern landscape and what's happened with invasive species, that really hasn't worked. So we have other options we have to do. Once it's in an area, you have to quit moving it around. Once it's established, you have to try to control it. So looking at that non-idealized situation, all of the above is pretty much what we have to do today. Stop new introductions and then try to deal with the ones we already have. But you guys are right. Once you let that genie out of a bottle, your options are much more limited. It's better to just deal with it by not bringing them in.
So the correct answer is all of the above. So you guys were not wrong necessarily, because that was included in all of the above. And I don't really think that many of us ever thought about invasive species in that term. So let's go ahead and check back in with Peru High School. Do you guys have any questions at the end of the segment for Mike? Peru, any other questions?
Is there any way we can stop kudzu from moving into northern Indiana?
Good question.
Right now, kudzu is kind of limited by its climatic needs. It hasn't moved too far north because it really can't survive the weather conditions. And that's another species you would have to wonder if climate change might allow it to move further north. But it really hasn't been able to move into northern Indiana or move very far into the state of Indiana.
Okay, and let's go ahead and check back in with Abby in the hot seat to see what questions have come in for you as well, Mike. Abby.
And the hot seat question of the moment with 8 votes is, what is the best way to protect against invasive species? And is there a way to heal the damage to an ecosystem caused by the invasive species? Now, students, don't forget to switch to topic 2 for the next scientists.
That's a great question, and I think it kind of relates to the multiple choice question we had. The best way to stop invasive species is to stop them before they invade, not bring them in. And once you bring them in, you really need to have kind of a multi-tiered response where you try to control the species. What's the second part?
Is there a way to heal the damage to an ecosystem?
That's a great question. So once you remove the species, once you, for example, control honeysuckle in the forest, you can do things like try to reintroduce natives and then try to keep it from returning to kind of allow the system to recover. A lot of times with invasive species, once you control the invasive, there is some resiliency, and sometimes the ecosystem can recover on its own if you prevent further invasions.
Okay, and then we also have email questions coming in by the dozens for you, Mike. So the first question is, have there ever been any good invasive species?
That's kind of a big debate in invasion ecology, whether there's any good invaders. Yeah, that's a hard one to answer. That's an excellent question, but in my personal opinion, if it's an invasive species, it's something that's not desirable. Even if it's something that birds can eat, there are natives, for example, with honeysuckle, there are native species that are more nutritious and birds should be eating. So if we label a species invasive, I would say I can't think of any that I would call a good thing. Now, we do have non-native species that are not invasive that are very important. You know, the plants that feed us, corn and wheat and soybeans, are not from this part of the world.
Right.
But they are non-natives and they're very important to feeding us, but they're not invasive. Okay. So there are some helpful non-natives, but if a species is labeled invasive, I would have a hard time seeing a positive.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mike.
You're welcome.
We've learned a lot just in this first segment, so we'll see you at the end of the show for more questions and answers.
Great.
Thanks. Okay, so here's the problem. The United Nations estimates that the world's population is going to increase to over 9 billion people by the year 2050. That means approximately 50 countries are projected to double in size. Double. Experts say that we're headed towards a crisis in providing affordable, nutritious food for this many people. We're going to be looking at one of the tools scientists are using to find an answer to this potential crisis: GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. So joining us live is plant scientist Katie Rainey. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Jessica.
Thanks for joining us today. This is also your first time here with us at zipTrips.
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about where you are today?
I'm in the Lilly Life Sciences Greenhouse Complex.
Okay, and then I know that you work in plant breeding and genetics. Can you tell us about your work?
Yes, I'm a soybean geneticist and breeder. So my ultimate goal as a scientist is to develop new and improved varieties of soybean with higher yields and also other valuable characteristics like drought tolerance. Every crop has breeders, and most of us work in the private sector for seed companies.
Okay, and then we wanted to talk today about the topic of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. Can you first start by telling us what GMOs are?
Right, so genetically modified organisms, I prefer to use the term transgenic. So those
Okay.
are equivalent terms, and transgenic is more scientific. So they're transgenic plants. They have genes inserted into their genome in order to provide the plant with some sort of new trait. And they're equivalent to other non-transgenic crop plants. They're virtually indistinguishable, and they certainly aren't like Frankenstein monsters like we saw in that funny animation.
Okay, so you said the word transgenic.
Transgenic.
That seems a little less scary than the word genetically modified.
Yeah, it's actually funny that you think the word genetically modified sounds scary. That's an example of the sort of conflation of the so-called issue around GMOs or transgenics that people think they're scary. I found that worrying about GMOs or debating their safety or just calling it an issue tends to distract us from actual real issues and more pressing topics like food security. Mm-hmm. And it tends to be a lightning rod for broader complaints about agriculture and industrialized agriculture in general. And also that, that distraction will prevent us from realizing the benefits of the technology.
So this is a way to genetically improve plants. How long have people been growing and eating foods that have been genetically modified?
Right.
Or improved?
Yeah, GMOs, genetic improvement, genetic modification, transgenic are all related topics, somewhat interchangeable. Mm-hmm. And people have been genetically improving crop plants for as long as agriculture's been in place. So 10,000 years, or in some cases, have plants been genetically modified or improved. And the same is true with animals. So everything that we eat, an animal or a plant, has been genetically improved or modified. And most crop plants cannot survive or grow without human intervention.
Okay, so what are some of the different ways plants are genetically modified or improved, I guess, besides the GMO method?
Right, so the transgenic or GMO method is one of a couple of options we have for genetically improving plants. Mm-hmm. And here's 4 of them that are listed. Breeding, the first one is what I do. Plants sexually reproduce through cross-pollination, and so breeders will control the parents of a cross-pollination by selecting the parents to have enhanced agricultural performance or just genetically superior. So that's one method of genetic improvement.
Okay.
Another method is mutagenesis. So mutations are the ultimate source of genetic variation. In fact, all of us as people have several thousand mutations in our genomes. And so we can induce mutations in crop plants in order to create new versions of genes and potentially create valuable genetic variation. A third method of genetic improvement that's relatively new is called genome editing. And this is where it's another biotechnology technique like transgenesis, where we engineer proteins and enzymes that are then introduced transiently into a genome, and they will actually change the genome sequence or the DNA sequence in a very targeted way. And finally, of course, there's transgenesis, where a foreign gene from outside the genome is introduced into the plant's genome.
Very good. And you work in the first one, right?
Yeah,
Breeding.
I'm a breeder.
So can you give us an example of a plant that has been genetically modified from its original form?
Right, so I mentioned that all plants that we eat have been genetically modified for the most part, and a great example is corn or maize. And I have a sort of visual example here. We're looking at corn chips, so we have blue corn versus white corn chip. And so these chips are actually made with blue corn or white corn. Maize was domesticated probably about 9,000 years ago in Mexico, which means it was domesticated from its wild form into something that humans cultivate. And the blue corn actually represents an older form of maize that was grown at least in the 1500s by Native Americans, and it could be older. So in here we see a picture. So there are older types of maize, and then the white corn chip that I was holding is an example of a more modern, genetically improved type. And so you can see there's a great deal of diversity in maize that's been selected by humans through genetic improvement. In this picture on the left, there's the wild maize. It's called teosinte, and then you see sort of a progression of selection for a higher yielding, more elite type. And all of that is accomplished through genetic improvement. And the point is that the genetic improvement involved with domestication and selection of elite types is much more drastic than anything that's achieved through transgenesis. So several genes are involved, many genes are involved with the improvement. And as we progress from the wild form, which you see on the left, which looks very different from modern corn. So that's a great illustration of the drastic genetic improvement that already took place tens of thousands of years ago, or thousands of years ago.
Gotcha. So transgenesis doesn't include breeding, so how does it happen?
Well, so a gene that is of interest is isolated from another species, like a bacteria, or it can be synthesized in the lab. And the gene has to be delivered into the plant's cells. And so in this illustration, we have a plant cells. The foreign DNA is on gold particles. The gold particles are bombarding the cell, and the foreign DNA then moves from the gold particle and integrates itself into the plant's genome. So that gold DNA helix then is the foreign gene. That's inserted and it's stable, and the plant will pass that new gene on to all of its progeny in all subsequent generations. So there's a new gene that's foreign from outside that's been introduced into the plant's genome.
Very cool stuff. So can you explain how it enables improvement?
Well, the biggest or the most successful applications of transgenic technology in crops that are being grown by farmers is what we call yield protection. So breeders like myself develop higher yielding crops. They have an innate yield, but then certain stresses will reduce the yield. So you can protect the yield with transgenes. One of the best examples of this is the BT corn.
Yeah.
So here's an example on the bottom of a corn ear that's been attacked by these caterpillars known as corn earworms. And then the ear of corn on the top is it comes from a transgenic corn plant that has the BT gene inserted into its genome. It's producing from that gene the BT protein, which is toxic to corn rootworm, so that the worm doesn't do the damage, and you don't have to spray the corn with insecticide in order to kill that corn earworm.
So even though it's toxic to the caterpillar or the worm, it's not toxic to eat.
Right, it's not toxic for humans to consume. Actually, the BT protein is broken down in your saliva in your mouth. So
Okay.
as soon as you eat it.
Speaking of eating, how is this technique going to help us with the question of how we're going to feed more than 9 billion people in the year 2050?
That's a great question. So we know we have to produce so much more food than we are now, and that'll be all populations of people will have to be producing their own food, of course, and they'll be doing this in an era of climate change. And so we have to do everything that we can to increase and also protect the yield of crops in order for there to be stable production and people can have what we call food security. The goal by 2050 is that everybody has, continuous access to nutritious food that enables them to live the best lifestyle that they can. And so the transgenesis is one of many tools that plant scientists are using to protect yields, to adapt crop plants to future climate change environments.
Well, I can see how that would help to get more food to more people. And you mentioned nutritious. Is this a healthier way?
It can be. So, for example, a food that's been produced from a transgenic plant that has a yield protection gene, the grain or the fruit was actually produced with less stress, and so should be optimized nutritionally. And then also, in some cases, the transgenic genes can reduce the need to apply pesticides like an insecticide, and so it can be better for the environment, and that means it may also be healthier for humans.
Okay, and then does it help plants from being wiped out from diseases?
Right, so there's a great example of the application of this technology with papaya. All papaya you can buy in the grocery store is transgenic. There was a virus a few decades ago that arose in papaya, and there's no known native resistance to this virus in the papaya species. So all cultivation of papaya would have been eliminated, and it wouldn't be available as a food. But then a really neat transgenic technology was used to then make the papaya resistant, and now we can enjoy papaya.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Learning something new every day. So are transgenic plants safe to consume?
They are safe to consume, and there's 3 lines of evidence that you should consider when deciding that transgenic plants are safe to consume. First of all, transgenic products that make it to the market, which means they make it into farmers' fields, are heavily regulated. They're regulated in the US by the FDA, the EPA, and the USDA, and then internationally there are other bodies that regulate them. And hundreds of millions of dollars are spent to collect the data to prove that they're safe and equivalent to the non-transgenic counterparts. The second line of evidence that they're safe is that most scientific regulatory bodies have stated that they are safe. So the Food and Drug Administration or the National Academy of Sciences in the US and some international organizations as well have come to the conclusion that they're safe based on the evidence. And then the third line of reasoning that GMOs are safe, or transgenic plants, is that, for example, pigs and chickens that we eat are fed almost exclusively transgenic corn and soybeans only in the form of animal feed. And that's been going on for decades. And we haven't seen any problem in livestock animals with, say, an increase in cancer or some other health problem. So that's a great evidence that they aren't causing any health problems for humans either.
Well, I think we've gotten a much better understanding on this issue for sure. Let's go ahead and check in with Purdue High School. Do you guys have a question for Katie? Purdue.
Are any of the cornea worms developing a resistance to the B+ corn?
The BT corn? Yeah, actually that's a great question. So the transgenic genes could be vulnerable for their target pests to overcome their efficacy. And so we have management strategies for that. One of them would include planting a certain percentage of acres that aren't transgenic or don't have the BT gene, and that's to provide a refuge and to help prevent resistance. But you're right. Any management of pests is vulnerable to a lack of efficacy over time, but there's some sophisticated strategies for preventing that.
Thank you, very interesting stuff. And let's go ahead and check in with Abby in the hot seat to see what questions have come in for you. Abby.
Zionsville High School submitted the hot question of the moment with 23 votes. It is, what can be done to change public perception of GMOs? Now students, go on and move to topic number 3 for the next scientist.
Oh wow, that's the big question. How do we change public perception? I think education in general about the safety of our food or the origins of our food, and educating people about sources of information. A lot of the public perceptions that are negative are based on marketing from food companies like restaurants or grocery stores that profit from selling you a non-transgenic product at a higher premium. So there's some restaurants and grocery stores recently that said they will not sell transgenic foods. Well, so then they're selling you other kinds of foods that could be more expensive, and none of that's based on scientific evidence, and so you have to examine the source of the information and the motives behind it.
Well, we consider you a very credible source, so thanks for that. We just had some email questions come in for you from our other schools, and one of the questions is, do you think that food made from GMOs should be labeled like organic food is labeled?
No, I don't think it should be. I mean, if it were to be labeled, that's okay as well, but I think that that will impose a lot of extra cost on the food to label it, because it has to be segregated from all other types of non-transgenic food, and really creates a burden on the food supply to track it. And I think what would end up happening is foods that aren't transgenic may be labeled as transgenic just because you can't exclude some possible trace amounts of the transgenes.
Got it. Well, thanks for having this great discussion, Katie. We'll see you at the end of the show with more questions, okay?
Looking forward to it.
Thanks.
Climate is a great invisible regulator in our lives. Every man reacts to it with his own built-in thermostat. Climate governs the way he feels, whether he is lackadaisical or full of energy. The extremes of climate can disturb his well-being, slow down his work with the fatigue caused by heat waves. Climate can even hurt his pocketbook as industries become weather-bound, causing interruptions to payrolls and profits. When there is an evenness of favorable climate, the human body can make the most of life, with many other practical benefits for home and industry.
Wow, I know we think about climate differently now. And with us now is Purdue plant scientist Jeff Dukes. Jeff is an ecologist here in the Departments of Forestry and Natural Resources and Biological Sciences. Welcome to the show again. You were here last year, so welcome back.
Thank you.
And Jeff, you're here to talk to us today about a very interesting topic, correct?
Well, I think so. I'm here to talk about climate change and how it affects plants and biomass and the cycling of carbon.
Very cool stuff. And you said climate change. It's a very serious issue for a lot of people, and perhaps I think it would be a good idea to explain what climate change is.
Right, so climate change just has to do with the fact that we are changing the temperatures and precipitation patterns on the planet. Mm-hmm. And this is happening because we're releasing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, as we call them, into the atmosphere. So we're burning fossil fuels, we're cutting down forests and turning them into agricultural fields. And these things, primarily the burning of fossil fuels, release gases into the atmosphere that trap heat. So basically it's like putting more blankets around the planet.
Right.
So, if you're cold at night, you'll put a blanket on, and one of the things that blanket does is it absorbs the infrared radiation that you give off, the heat that you give off, and it warms up, and then it gives some of that warmth right back to you. Well, that's what greenhouse gases do in the atmosphere. They absorb some of that radiation that the planet gives off, and they radiate that heat back down to us. And if we put more and more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then we end up getting a warmer and warmer planet.
Gotcha. So we heard earlier how climate change was having implications on things like invasive species, as well as being able to produce enough food for a growing population, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There are major impacts on basically all the species on Earth from climate change. Now, they haven't all occurred yet. There are different, climate change is occurring at different rates in different places, and we expect to see much more in the future than we've seen so far. Mm-hmm. But the implications are really, really stark.
And so what is a carbon cycle? I've heard this term before. I hear you have a bathtub analogy for it.
Yeah, right. So the carbon cycle is related to climate change because it's carbon in the atmosphere that is one of the greenhouse gases in the form of carbon dioxide. So yeah, I have this bathtub analogy. I mean, you can think of the atmosphere as being a reservoir of carbon dioxide, like mm-hmm. a bathtub is a reservoir of water. And the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to affect the temperature of the planet. Carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere by plants when they're conducting photosynthesis, right? It's one of the main substrates that they use. They build sugars with it.
Sure.
They grow, then they die, and they decompose. And when they decompose, they're getting eaten by microbes. The microbes respire They use the sugars in the plant, they respire that carbon dioxide back up to the atmosphere, just like we respire and exhale back to the atmosphere. But then that carbon goes back into the atmosphere, and so that you can think of this as sort of this big cycle. It's just one part of the carbon cycle, but the CO2 being taken up by plants and released back to the atmosphere is one very important portion of the carbon cycle.
Right.
And then now, with burning lots of fossil fuels, we're basically unlocking these geological reservoirs of coal and petroleum.
That have been mined.
Exactly, yeah. So we're mining these deposits of carbon that was taken out of the atmosphere millions of years ago by plants, and we're putting it back into the atmosphere. So we're raising the level in that reservoir, and that means more carbon is available to be taken up by plants, and then there's potentially a bigger store of carbon that then can decompose and goes back into the atmosphere. So we're sort of ramping up the carbon cycle, but in the end, what really matters is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. How much do we have there? Because that's controlling the temperature of the planet. One of the things that I'm studying and that a lot of ecologists are really interested in is how the change in the CO2 in the atmosphere and the changes in the climate actually affect the growth of plants and the sort of decomposition of plants and the loss of soil carbon through that process of decomposition. Because if there's more carbon stored in the plants or less carbon stored in the soil, that's going to affect then how much is in that bathtub, in that reservoir.
Right.
You know, and so it's the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere that determines the climate. So the plants and the soils have a big impact on climate, and we try to understand that sort of thing.
Very cool stuff. And I hear you're the director of a specific project studying this very question. Can you tell us about that project?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a research project in the Boston area. There are a bunch of people working there that you can see there. And we're trying to look at the effects of things like driving our cars and burning fossil fuels on the environment, on ecosystems. So we've got about an acre of land in Waltham, Massachusetts that we've covered with this I'd call it like a time machine.
Yeah.
It's got lots of heaters, and we're changing precipitation, and we're basically moving little plots of land into 12 possible future climates. And we're looking at how different species respond. You can see the heaters right there in that picture. We're studying lots of things about plant growth and the loss of soil carbon. And you can see the heaters actually work there. They've melted out the snow in the winter. We have grasses and wildflowers growing there and different tree species, and we look at their responses and try to quantify their responses in a way that we can put them into models, into climate models, and then make projections for what the future is going to look like, how temperature is going to change in different parts of the world.
That's really fascinating. And you've set up a mini experiment to study this very question here in the studio. So you've got all these gadgets. Tell me what they are. What are you doing here?
Yeah, so I don't have a whole acre of land to work with here to bring it to the studio or something. So I have a very much smaller version of this where we're looking at not the plants themselves, but we're looking at the carbon from the plants that's gone into the soils, and we're looking at how the microbes in those soils chew up the carbon in the soils and return it back to the atmosphere, and how that's affected by climate, different sort of temperatures and different moistures, could be like different precipitation regimes.
Sure.
And so these little buckets here each have the same amount of soil in them.
Okay.
And what we're doing is we're essentially subjecting them to 4 different climates or 4 different environments here, right? So these two are both just room temperature.
Okay.
These two over here are not room temperature. If you put your hand down here, you can feel I've got them on a heating pad, so they're warmed up a bit. And so we have the cool buckets and the warm buckets.
So cool, dry.
And then we have the dry ones back here, and these two in front I've added some water to, so the soils are a little bit wetter. The soils were relatively dry when I got them the other day. And so what we're asking here is a very simple version of the question that we had out in the field near Boston, which is just how do these environmental conditions affect the rate at which microbes are consuming the carbon in the soil and basically exhaling it to the atmosphere, respiring it to the atmosphere. We've got the soil in the buckets so that the CO2 that is released by the microbes it builds up in here, and we can measure it with these little CO2 monitors that are sticking in here. And I have temperature monitors, just simple thermocouple probes in here to look at the temperature and make sure that we do actually have temperature differences between the different treatments. So the question is, do microbes like cooler conditions or warmer conditions, and do they like drier conditions or wetter conditions?
Okay, for
And
the release of CO2
Exactly.
into the atmosphere.
Yeah, when the microbes are happier, essentially happier, right? They're going to be eating that carbon faster and respiring it into the atmosphere faster, and so the concentration will build up. The concentration of CO2 will build up faster in the bucket. So we want to see where's the concentration of CO2 building up fastest. Under which conditions are the microbes going to be eating up that carbon the fastest, taking it out of the soil and returning it to the atmosphere?
Okay, so for our students who are watching, that is the question. Which one is it? Is it the cool dry? Is it the warm dry? Is it the cool wet? Or is it the warm wet that releases the most amount of CO2 into the atmosphere? For our hot seat users, what do you guys think? Go to our poll and vote. And Purdue High School will be asking your opinion very soon. Okay, so what is this portion of this experiment? These look like little calculators or something.
Yeah, right. So these are like little computers. They're the recording part of the experiment. They're attached to the sensors, and so we have data coming in. And so right here in the graphs that I have on them now, we have the CO2 concentration shown on the y-axis here, and time on the x-axis. And so we can see the CO2 concentration changing over time, and as the concentration of CO2 builds up, I mean, this one is connected to the warm wet bucket. So as the CO2 concentration builds up in this bucket, then we can see it going up over time on the graph here. And what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the slopes of these lines so that you can represent, we'll just put a linear equation, we use a linear equation to fit these points, and we'll look at the slope of that linear equation, the m term on here. You know, you can fit a line and use mx plus b, y equals mx plus b as a function to fit that. We'll look at the m term, the slope term, to determine in which of these buckets the CO2 concentration is increasing the fastest.
Okay, so let's go ahead and check in with Abby in our hot seat to see what the result is. Abby.
In the hot seat, our hot seat users predict that it will be the warm, wet conditions that will release CO2 faster.
Okay, thanks, Abby. So, Jeff, what are the results?
Well, they're right.
We find out. They're right?
They're right. It's the warm, wet. Yeah. So if we look at all the different slopes on here, it does turn out this one that we were looking at before, the warm, wet conditions is the one where the slope is increasing the fastest. And so microbes, they don't like it too dry.
Right.
And they don't like it too cold. Under the warmer and wetter conditions, they're typically the happiest. Now, you can get too warm or too wet, but yeah. In this experiment, in these conditions, that's where they're happiest.
Okay, so now that we have those results of the CO2 experiment, what are the implications and how will you use this type of information going forward?
Right, so an experiment like this is simplified, but it's useful for illustrating the concept. Out in the field, what we're interested in is not just how microbes respond to the different conditions sort of in the short term, like we're looking at here, but we want to understand how long-term changes like climate change might alter the nature of that response. So we know that in the warmer conditions, the microbes respired faster here. Well, if the microbes have been exposed to warmer conditions for decades, then is that response going to be the same, or are they going to acclimate to those warmer conditions over time, and are we going to see the nature of that response changing? If so, then we need to represent it differently in climate models. We need to take into account the fact that microbial communities might not always respond the way that they respond today.
Right.
So that's the sort of thing that we're looking at in the field.
Well, very interesting stuff. We're going to take your questions at the end of the show, okay? So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, we hope you've had a great time meeting some real-life plant scientists here at Purdue University and have learned some things too. We do have some time for more of your questions for all of the scientists in today's show, so let's go ahead and check back in with Peru High School. What is your question for our scientist?
What is the most abundant invasive species in the United States?
Who would like, Jeff would, or who would feel most comfortable taking that one? Mike?
That's a really good question. If you look at sheer abundance, some of the pathogens and insects, you can have millions and millions and millions of individual organisms. If you look at how large of an area certain species are found, some of the invasive plants, things like a mere honeysuckle, can cover very large areas. So it kind of depends on how you define that question. But there's a whole suite of species that are highly abundant.
Okay, and let's go ahead and check in with Abby in our hot seat.
The hot seat users have a question for Jeff, and it is, if there's so much evidence that shows that climate change is happening, why is the government still arguing about if it's real or not?
So that's a great question, and I find it really frustrating. I mean, the scientific community is really clear that climate change is happening, and that it's happening in large part because of burning fossil fuels and converting forests to agricultural zones. And what's going on in Washington with the politicians is really just politics. It's not anything to do with the science. It's that there are political considerations that come into play, and some people are worried about how much it would cost or what it would do to jobs. And so it's really more to deal with climate change. And so it's more a discussion about what we should do to deal with climate change, I think. And that discussion may be motivated, or some arguments in the political circles may be motivated by those political questions, but the science is really clear at this point on climate change.
Thanks, Jeff. And then we had an email question come in for Katie, and the question is there ever a downside to GMOs?
The primary downside to GMOs might be economic, that they might change the economics of the seed markets. And then the downsides, there are downsides to GMOs, but those are regulated and monitored before a product is commercialized. For example, you don't want to release a transgenic crop in an area where there's a lot of the native species present. So you wouldn't want a transgenic sunflower in North America because there's a lot of native sunflower species that it could naturally cross-pollinate with in nature. Another example is that GMO maize is banned from certain states in Mexico because that's where the teosinte originated, and where there's the sort of land races of, or the older varieties of corn still being cultivated by indigenous populations.
Thanks, Katie. And for the questions we were not able to get to today, we will be sending out an email with the most frequently asked questions from today's show for teachers to review with their students. And for future zipTrips, please just keep checking those emails and the zipTrips website for updates. Well, thank you to all of our scientists in the studio and to our crew. They do an awesome job behind the scenes. And then also to you out there for watching. We'll see you next time on the next episode of zipTrips. Bye.